So I'm virtually in Ukraine, and Professor Hrytsak is really in Ukraine, in Lviv. It's already 10 p.m., and we are very grateful for him to join us at this late hour. So it's my pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Hrytsak again at KRIS, this time virtually. Professor Hrytsak is a leading Ukrainian historian, professor of the Ukrainian Catholic University, where he also chairs the program in Jewish Studies. He's also director of the Institute of Historical Studies of Ivan Franko National University and chief editor of the scholarly journal Ukraina Moderna. He has authored more than a dozen monographs on the topics of Ukrainian and Eastern European history and the formation of modern nations. He corrected me that he published more recent book in February 2022, but the book that I read last, Narys Istoria Ukrainy, the outline of the history of Ukraine, studied the history of national formation on both sides of the river's Bruch. And today in his talk, he will challenge some of the false premises of the Kremlin propaganda and will show how history can be instrumentalized as a modern warfare. So it's my pleasure to welcome Yaroslav, and I will start sharing the screen.
Thank you so much, Julia, for your kind presentation, and thank you for organizing this thing. Also, thank you. Also, send my gratitude to Giovanna for having me here. It's really a pleasure to see you and to share my thoughts. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I won't be telling about that much about using the history as a propaganda, because exactly my topic has another focus. But let me start with some kind of the military observation. I'm not a military expert, but I used to listen to those who are really have something to say when it comes to the history. If I have made the next slide. So there is an expert which I trust the most, and his name is Michael Kaufman. I believe that many of you may know him. He is a leading expert in the Pentagon, in some other think tanks, and he has his podcast, War on the Rocks, which I strongly recommend you to listen. And in one of his podcasts, he discussed with his friend, the interlocutor, what would happen. May I have next slide, Yulia, if I may? What would happen if by any chance Zelensky would be assassinated by the very beginning of the war? Because basically his point was that the war was won during the first decade of the March, and more particularly probably during the first 3 days of this kind, so what is called restricted military operation by Putin. So basically, you probably know that there are several times assassination of Zelensky at that time, and they discussed what would happen if Zelensky would be killed. And the response was that they say, yes, it would be a tragedy for Ukraine, it would be a personal tragedy for Zelensky and his family, but that wouldn't affect that much the war itself, the course of the war. Because there is business being, they say basically, look at the mayors of the city, of Odessa, Kharkiv, Kyiv, or Mariupol, or Mykolaiv. They all act independently, and they act like a small Zelenskys, so to say. So basically, they don't wait for a kind of order from above, and they have a lot of initiative. And basically, this is how the Ukrainian society waged the war. It's not top down, it's actually bottom up. And this makes Ukrainian society, Ukrainian army that much efficient, dynamic, all the kind of things. And if I made the next slide. And basically, this is the story, because if you compare how the Russian army and Russian command deploys their action on the field, this is something very much different, dramatically different, I would say. You probably read the recent article in The Guardian, which is kind of has estimation of how the Russian army leads the war. And basically they say that Putin is involved in war at the level of colonel, which means on the very low level. And this is something which they believe it's very much intrinsic for a way the Russian army waged the war, which basically says that it's all top down and initiative is not really that much tolerated or permitted. And you could also see this as evidence. This is a stunning number of Russian generals who has been killed in Ukraine since the Russian invasion, 18 Russian generals and commanders. So basically, military experts that this has something to do. There are many factors, but this has something to do exactly with this kind of the way how the Russians exercise the army. So basically, this is the generals who taking care of very small command on the field. So therefore, they became quite often this kind of the victims of the killers, the snipers, all the kind of things. So what I'm telling here, this is something very distinct. What is this distinction? Military distinction tells you a lot about differences between Ukrainian and Russian society. Next slide, if I may. This is not the only differences. Differences are many. If you compare the milieu, the closest entourage of Putin and Zelensky, first what comes to your eye is a kind of striking difference of the age. Age of Putin is 69, Zelensky is 42, and this also relates to his team, because basically the average age of the Russian MP is between 50 and 60. The average age of the Ukrainian MP is between 30 and 40. So basically, it could be just said that this is some difference between father and sons. It's two different generations who leading the war. And there is a quoting Dmitry Gurin, a former Russian journalist who left Russia for Ukraine. He became a leading journalist in Ukraine. Also, he's a member of Ukrainian MP. And he basically says that if you have a country, and this is Ukraine, we're talking about Ukraine, when people who are engaged in changing the constitutions are below the 40 years, this is transit to successful European democracy in this country is inevitable. So basically, this is something we also differentiate, because you have in Ukraine rotation of elites, and Ukraine has become younger and younger, and you don't really have it in Russian case. And the next slide. And the next difference, and it's also difference that related to the war, is if you compare the ethnic composition, so to say, national identity ethnic composition. This is the closest milieu of Zelensky. There is at least one person who is missing from there. But if you look closely, who are these people? So Zelensky is a Jew. Prime Minister, he's the first chancellor are Ukrainians. His another head of the administration is Russian. And the head of this party president is Georgian. And again, the name I'm referred to, this legendary mayor of Mykolaiv, Vitaly Kim, who is Korean by origin, and they said he may be the next president of Ukraine. You could see that this is very much ethnically mixture. Each of them believe they're Ukrainian, but they are of very much different origin. Something also tells you about character of nowadays identity. So what I'm telling here is this is something crucial differences between Ukrainian society and Russian society, as it been seen by the war, because the war makes the things very visible. There's something which was not that much, so to say, that easy to observe during the peaceful time. During the time of the war, when everything is mobilized, the difference became very, very clear. And this is something which runs against this kind of the Putin's estimations or hopes or predictions, whatever you name it, because basically Putin believes, and may I have next slide, that Ukraine as a country is not existent, as a nation is not existent. It's a non-entity. As Russians say, it's a country 404, which means on the internet, if you put something and you don't find this is 404. And this is the country that's been totally created by Bolshevik, by Lenin and communist Russia. So this is basically his point that there's something which could not and should not exist. And there is an impression, I would say the first impression, superficial impression probably, that this war is very much about the history. And Putin heavily depends on the history arguments. He basically claims that what is Ukraine is a part of Russia's space because this once has been Kiev Rus, all the kind of things. So basically, he has all legitimate rights to claim this territory and its own. And I would say that many Ukrainian historians, also Western historians, they attempt to argue or to do dispute with Putin just to disclaim his arguments. But I believe it doesn't really make sense because dealing with Putin on history is like playing with chess with a pigeon. Probably you know this kind of story because it knocks the pieces over, craps on the board, and flies back to its flock to claim its victory. So what I'm making, it doesn't. You shouldn't take this argument of Putin by face value, because I would rather say, and I would tell it by the very end, it's rather smokescreen which hides the real motivation and really what's going on the field, so to say. So if I may, next slide. There is another reason why you should not dispute with Putin, because Putin is not dealing with history per se. He is addressing historical memory. And there is some paradox character of the historical memory, which has been noticed by Ernest Renan, the famous French historian, who in 1882 made this very, very important and brilliant speech, What is the Nation? And in which he made some kind of paradoxical conclusion. And one of them is that getting history wrong is a part of being a nation, which means historical memory is not about real history. It's about distortion of history. In the sense that historical memory is not about what we try to recollect, but what we try to forget and to silence. So by this token, every historical memory by definition is wrong. And Putin knows it. Putin knows that he is lying, but so he believes that everybody does the same. And I would like to just quote a very good question, very good book, which I recommend strongly to read if you want to know the inner sides of the Russian society nowadays. Is a book written by a younger British journalist who used to work for the Russian TV for several years, Peter Pomerantsev. By the way, he is the son of a rather famous Ukrainian dissident who moved from the Soviet Ukraine to Great Britain and became commentator on BBC in the 70s, and this is his son. So Peter Pomerantsev worked for a long time in TV, Russian TV, and he wrote this book, which is really brilliant. Nothing is true and everything is possible. And he shows in this book to what extent the Russian regime depends on mass media, most particularly on TV, and how they create this kind of reality, which most of Russians believe. And basically, this is reality that is based on lie, but on a lie which they believe everybody lies, so to say. And Peter Pomerantsev defines the Russia not that much as an authoritarian regime, but mostly postmodern authoritarian regime, because this is postmodernity, which everything goes. So since everything goes, nobody has a truth, so everybody can lie. So what I'm saying here, you could easily write an article or two, or probably a book about how the Russia and Putin personally manipulates Ukrainian and Russian history, but it doesn't serve you the aim to tell you the story of what's really going on the field, so to say, and what could be possible results of this war. So instead of this kind of historical memory, which is very much popular, I suggest to address the other kind of memo of history, which I used in my recent book, which is Global History Ukraine. And this is basically longue durée and global perspective. May I have a next slide, if you please? So you probably know there's the Annales School, French school. That was probably one of the best schools in history that ever existed. In the 20th century, they came with the idea longue durée. And this idea was authored by Fernand Braudel, the famous French historian, and basically says that you want to understand the current history, you should dig deeper. So go into long-term processes, so to say, or paces. And this history was very much popular until the 80s, and then it collapsed. And it collapsed for a variety of reasons. And as I said, the historians changed the telescope with microscope. They went in the microhistory. Instead of history, they started to historical memory. And this is mostly the stage of the history in the recent 2 or 3 decades. But then a few years ago, we have a new cry, a kind of battle cry in history, and this has been represented by History Manifesto, written by nobody else by David Armitage, the former dean of the history at the Harvard University. And basically, they demand to return to longue durée, because basically says that they're giving the seriousness of the problems, the threats that the human race is now facing. This history should be treated very seriously. And one of the ways how to use the history, not abuse, but history, to return to longue durée, And this should be kind of history that serves as a guide to action the present and using resources of the past. Again, I won't quote that much, but basically the story is that if you want to get understanding what is at the stake, just try to extend the context, both in time, both geographically and historically. And this is where I want to start now from this point. I may have a next slide. This is the history that has not been practiced that much by historians, I would say, but mostly for political scientists and history of the economical historians. Even so, they're not that much popular about the regular historians. I found those works very fascinating. I've used it for the last 20 years exactly to produce my global history of Ukraine, and I found them very helpful in many ways. And if I would start for some kind of the starting premises, the one is that during the last 200 years, we are experiencing some which could be called quantum leap in human history, which basically could be described briefly as a farewell to alms, farewell to poverty. Since the era of Napoleon War, 1820 approximately, we have this kind of a rise of the standards, economic standards, life expectancy, very important. Anything that could go, so to say, there's drastic changes, but this is drastic changes for the last 200 years. And they were important to understand what is going on, because basically before that, it was basically a world of the violence, a world of the poverty, and a world of the despots. Since then, we have a kind of new era, which is a world of well-being, relative peace, and democracy. And somehow those processes are related to each other. Here you see the book by Angus Maddison, a leading British economical historian who calculated GDP per capita for the last 1,000 years. I don't really understand how he did it, but he did it. And judging by review, it is quite reliable. And you could see really the crucial difference starts around 80-20, when this is how the kind of feeling of the real kind of the progress. And historians are debated why we started exactly the last 200 years, why not earlier or later, and also why it started in Western Europe, but not the other parts of the world, like China. It probably have a better chance for such kind of progress. And here I would like to turn your attention to another book, and may I have the next slide? This is a book that has been written by a leading economist, Nobel Prize winner, Douglas North, in cooperation with his colleagues. And this basically discusses the same issue. And his basic premise is that a lot depends on the violence. Since violence has been the constant, so to say, factor of human history, what has been changed for the last 200 years, that violence started to be very much limited. By emancipation of various classes and groups of the society, by endowing with the political rights, with changing the game of the rule, the kind of things. And basically says that this is something which is very much exception. It's not a norm, because throughout all the written history, violence was a norm, and basically he describes a natural state. And in this sense, there is no big difference, say, between the Mesopotamia of the third millennium, Britain under Tudors, or modern Russia under Putin. They all are natural states. When the change started, when you have a kind of political modernization, with this political modernization, when you have a limit of violence, when you have a breaking of the patent-client networks, all the kind of things, you have an emergence of the independent organizations, institutions, and they provide some impetus for the economical development. And what he claims on the very end, that this is still a very much, so to say, exception, because basically this kind of the open access, as he call it, it's still characterized only 25 countries and 35% of the countries and 50% of the world population. So basically, this is very much of the golden exception, so to say. And basically, it's limited to the Europe and its offspring. I know it's some kind of political incorrect, because I will say that nowadays the Eurocentrism consider me not quite kosher, but Douglas North is probably free of any kind of the estimations of some kind guesses. He basically deals with the statistical materials to try to find this kind of correlation. May I have a next slide? For sure, in the 20th century, we have a large disaster of the First and Second World War, 30 years of the extreme violence when modernity has derailed. And it takes probably 30 years or really more or less for the beginning of the 50s, when the most of the Western country returned to the level of 1913, a year before the war. But again, since the Second World War, it's becoming more and more widespread, this kind of the pattern. And more importantly, it spreads to the second and third world, if I may use this kind of not politically correct term, but basically it's spread outside of the historical fatherland of the modernity, which is Western Europe and its offspring. And nowadays it become a global phenomenon, but there's something happened there. And this is something which is very important to understand. May I have a next slide? Because then you have an emergence of new type of the modernization, which is called the modernization for above, or modernization which is based on the strategy, conscious strategy, when the country focusing on the achieving high rates of economic growth without political modernization. So that's mean in the absence of democratization. And basically, you could know probably the symbol Lee Kuan Yew, the famous Singapore president who made the country from the poor to very rich, one of the best, the most opulent country in the world. And basically, this is something you have a lot of this kind of the modern dictators like August Pinochet, like probably even before the war, Mussolini and Stalin and Hitler, and then again many of them in recent times. So basically, this is something which is very much attractive, tempting for many states outside of the West world to emulate the examples. Because basically, when you start this modernization, the results are very, very, say, impressive. Because basically, when the country is poor and once you start economic reforms, the standards of living, they raise dramatically in a very short time. But the problem is, irony is, as Danny Roderick, the Harvard professor of economics, put it, that for every president, for every Lee Kuan Yew, you have many Mobutus, which means that those examples of the modernization from above that's successful are very, very rare. In most of the cases, those rather fail than succeed. May I have a next slide? And basically, you may have three phases of this kind of the modernizing the dictators. And actually, you probably guess very easily that Putin and Lukashenko and other presidents from the former Soviet place, they exactly demonstrate this kind of case, that they try to achieve the economic development without political modernization. And this is, I would say, this process has three phases. Again, I'm referring here to the studies of the Russian historian economist Gelman and the Polish historian who now resides in the United States, Adam Przybylski. And basically what they say, and they concur in their arguments, that on the first phase one, you have an emergence of this kind of the dictator, and he looks very swayed, or he or she, or basically it's him, because they look very much macho. It's very gender-oriented dictators. They look very much swayed. They want to behave to the words of the, say, respected leaders. They play piano like Putin does, or they appear in different advertisements, so to say, and they are very much loved by the Western audience because they give a promise to modernize the country. And this is basically the story how Putin was very much popular by Germany, in Germany, because they believe that once you have this kind of economic reforms, sooner or later the economic reforms will bring to political modernization, and then Russia will become quite a normal country. And this is the phase one. This phase one could be a very long one, and sometimes it's taken as a kind of symbol of success. But this is not the end of the story, it's only the beginning. Because in the short time or a long time, depends on the circumstance. You may have a next slide. There emerge a dilemma, and they call dilemma of a monarch. And there is some kind of paradox here, because sooner or later, under this modernizing dictator, you have a emergence of a new middle class, because economic reforms, if they are successful, and they are mostly, they lead to emergence of a new middle class. Once the class emerge, it starts demanding political reforms. And this is exactly what you have in case of the Russia or Belarus, Bolotny Street, or the recent protests in Belarus or in Kazakhstan. Because basically, even if you have this kind of economic reform, the nepotism and corruption only prevails. And therefore, for the new middle class, it's very much natural, so to say, to demand the political rights, to fight against corruption, all the kind of things. And probably the living symbol of this protest is dignity of this middle class. May I have a next slide? And then comes the third slide phase that was exactly experienced now, the assassination, arrest of the oppositional leaders, the repressions against the manifestations, and most importantly, militarism, and turns to the rhetoric of nationalism and the kind of xenophobic nationalism. And basically, they choose as a main target of these attacks would be the West. They blame this as the West to try to undermine the regime. And in the case of Russia, its West is very much embodied by Ukraine, because since they don't believe that Ukraine has a kind of sole agency, they believe this is the NATO that stands behind Ukraine. And therefore, this is really what Putin believes, judging by many leaks. He doesn't believe he's fighting Ukraine per se, he's fighting NATO on the Ukrainian territory. So despite all this rhetoric, what is important here, that Ukraine comes into the picture. And Ukraine here serves as a kind of the main target of this rhetoric during the third phase. May I have a next slide? We used to think about Putin as a creature of KGB. And this is true, this is right. But we tend to forget that Putin started his career as a political leader in the milieu of the Russian opposition, anti-communist opposition, the ones that fight the communists, and to a certain extent also Gorbachev as a president of the Soviet Union. This is milieu that was presented by Yeltsin himself, and also by Sobchak, who was that time mayor of Leningrad, and also he was a patron of Putin when he started his career. Recently, there has been published memoirs of Alexander Tsipko. Alexander Tsipko has been advisor to Gorbachev, and he claims, and I believe have reason to believe him, that in 1881, when the Soviet Union were close to collapse, this milieu of Yeltsin, Sobchak, and Starovoytova, she is there on the picture, they were discussing what to do with Ukraine, because they saw that collapse of the Soviet Union may be imminent, and they have to have some kind of strategy. And also, it's very important that since since Yeltsin and Gorbachev, they fought for the power, for Yeltsin, it's very important to let Ukraine go. But this is only the start of the game. This milieu came to the conclusion that they should Ukraine go, but on the one condition, that sooner or later, Ukraine will come back. They believe that since Ukrainian nation is not existent, and Ukrainian elites are not, so to say, they are not really efficient, that sooner or later, Ukrainian independence will collapse. And in the due time, sooner or later, probably sooner than later, Ukraine would return back, but this time on begging to be accepted back, but on her knees. And this provides them with a chance to dictate the new condition, much better condition, to integrate Ukraine back into the Russian space. Again, as I said, it's memoirs of Alexander Tsipko, and he claimed that this is the strategy that was described or explained to him and other members of the Gorbachev milieu by Starovoytova during one of these meetings in that time, the leading newspaper, Moscow News. And what happened afterward, you have this, may I have next slide? what happened afterward, that actually that Ukraine experienced a very deep political crisis, but still it survived this crisis, and Ukraine proved to be a very sustainable and relatively politically stable community, to much of surprise of many observants, both in Russia and outside, even in Ukraine, so to say. And then on the beginning of this century, under Kuchma, you have the exactly emergence of this middle class, which went to the street. And then you have Orange Revolution as a kind of the symbol of this emergence of new circumstances. Let me just share my personal story. I do remember when I first heard the predictions that revolution is bound to happen, to start in Ukraine. And this was exactly 12th of September of 2001, one day after the New York attack. It has no relation to the, just happened so, to the New York attack, because at that day we heard the presentation by Yevhen Holovacha. He's even in the picture. He's leading Ukrainian sociologists, and they monitoring Ukrainian societies, attitudes, identities since the beginning of the Ukrainian independence. And he said basically that by the end of the 90s, they found a very interesting new developments, which were never experienced, was surprised them. So basically the story was, if you ask Ukrainians, how would you compare your well-being in comparison with the previous year? Do you live better or worse? The standard answer would be worse and worse and worse. But if you in the same survey ask the people, interviews, whether during the last year you bought an apartment, a car, or a computer, have you enjoyed any summer vacation, or whether you went abroad, the answer will be yes and yes and yes. And basically, Holovacha says, it doesn't mean that they telling the truth in one case and lying in the other case. They tell the truth in both cases, because basically what happens there, that thing like a car or a computer is not symbol of the well-being anymore. Because since you have an emergence of new class, which has a new expectations, high expectations, and they plan it in the long time, and while you have emergence of this class, you could expect political turmoil, probably revolution. Because the autocratic regime like that time was in Ukraine, Kuchma, could not, so to say, satisfy their needs. And as a result, you have this kind of political activity. And this is exactly what happened. Exactly in 2004, this prediction proved to be very right, even so we didn't believe at that time. We were skeptical about these arguments, but he proved to be wrong, because 3 years later, we have this Orange Revolution. May I have the next slide? Benny says that 2004 was a breaking point in Putin biography. He took the Orange Revolution as a very serious threat to his regime and to him personally, because he believed this is very much plot against him. And again, since they expected Ukraine would become back to Russia, and the time was going on, and there's nothing like that happened. Ukraine started to depart. So in 2008, Kremlin and Putin personally, they elaborated and accepted a new strategy toward Ukraine. And this is a strategy which was, the timing is very important. The strategy has been accepted exactly after the Georgian War. Since the victory in Georgian war was relatively easily, it gave Putin a self-assurance that he could do anything he wants on this space. And very importantly, since he noticed that West took this Russian aggression against Russia relatively peacefully, there was no kind of sanction. So he believed he could continue, because basically his presumption was that West is too weak to interfere. So what was the plan? The plan was so fantastic that nobody really wanted to believe at that time. It leaked to an Italian magazine, Limes, the magazine that focused on geopolitics. And then it has been republished in the leading Ukrainian newspaper, Zerkalo Nedeli. It is published by nobody else but the head of the Secretary of Security, Gorbulin, a very wise man, by the way. Russian-speaking, Russian ethnical, and basically he says that this is really endangered. The Ukrainians face a mortal danger. And basically, what was the plan? The plan was that independently, regardless what Ukraine will do in the future, it has to face a military aggression. And there were two premises on which this decision has been made. First, that 2015 may be a crucial time, because this will be 25 years for the Ukrainian independence, and this is exactly time of the emergence of a new generation. And this generation has no memory about the Soviet Union, and even so, many of them Russian-speaking, they are more oriented toward the West, and this may cause a change of elites in Ukrainian capital, which will be more oriented toward the West, and this would be more a kind of danger, existential for Russia, because Russia in that case may leave Ukraine for the West. And second conclusion premises was that the changes of the elites, the coming to power of Russian-speaking elites, does really solve the problem. Because once the Russian-speaking elites come to the capital, they change their orientation, and instead, following their promises to bring Ukraine closer to Russia, they also keep orienting toward the West. And here is the case of Kuchma, is very telling. So as a result, regardless what Ukraine would do, Ukraine should face or be a target of military aggression. And this military aggression should lead to partition of Ukraine into three parts. The largest part, so-called Novorossiya, on the line of Kharkiv-Uman, which is divide Ukraine into parts, Russian-speaking, Ukrainian-speaking. So basically, this is south and east of Ukraine. This part should be turned into so-called New Russia or Novorossiya, and has to be annexed to Russia as a part of the Russian state. What remained of the Ukraine, basically northern part and central part, together with Kyiv, should be transformed in the vassal kind state with a puppet regime in Kyiv, which will be loyal to Moscow. And the rest of Ukraine, which is the West, is not lives in the interest of Moscow because it's too much toxic. This is the region which Putin believes has been lost for the Russian world forever, because it's too much oriented toward the West and very much national and not nationalistic. So it may go whatever it will, even to the devil. So this is basically the point. So what I'm saying here again, in 2009, this plan has been revealed, but only few people tend to believe it because they believe it's basically a fantasy. And I remember my friend, who is a colleague expert on the security, went to Warsaw at the beginning of September 2013, few months before the Euromaidan. And he has his presentation built on this plan, and nobody really believed. He's ridiculed. He said that only one older diplomat, German diplomat, met him in the corridor, said, basically, you're right, but we're not allowed to tell you the whole story. So the story was that once the Maidan started, may I have the next slide? Maidan, in a way, saved the situation, because Maidan started a year earlier, 2013 to 14. And actually, why 2015? Again, the one thing that I tend to forget, because 2015 would be the next election, presidential elections. And Putin was sure that elections would be manipulated by Yanukovych, so they will have a new Maidan. And that set also great political instability, and this provides legitimacy for the Russian government and Russian army to interfere, to induce so-called stability. So they were basically focusing on 2015. Luckily enough for us, the Maidan started earlier, for which Russia was not prepared. And what followed then, that during the Maidan, already the second half of Maidan, we were sure that this plan, which we described before, was very much real. That the real problem of Ukraine was not Yanukovych anymore, but Putin. I know it for sure because at that time I worked as expert in the Poroshenko team on Maidan. I know that this is the only scenario they regarded. They considered that the Ukraine has a time until the end of the Olympic Games because the military would follow immediately. And this is exactly what happened. And basically, it's an anexion of Crimea. And then again, this kind of the spread of the, or provoking of the Donbass separatism by Girkin, who was a Russian officer. But basically, the story was the kind of scenario was that you should not be prepared to the large-scale war. What would happen would do just would be introduce some kind of limited military operation, and then it would be welcome by a Russian-speaking population, in the sense that Russian-speaking population would welcome the Russian troops with flowers, and this would put the end toward to Russian state. It was a huge miscalculation. It was a huge miscalculation because it never happened. Ukraine has lost Crimea and Donbass, but basically it was kind of small fry to what has to come, expectations to Putin. And we naively believe that this failure of this plan, so-called Russian Spring, which lasted until extended to the summer and then finished by the end of the year during the winter of 2014. So we naively believe, many of us, that end of the Russian Spring also meant the failure of the Russian strategy plan, and Putin would abandon this plan. This was very naive, really, because what we have now, in 2022, the 24th of February, we have this kind of this plan has been implemented again. May I have next slide? I'm listening to different kind of leaks and follow this kind of leaks. And you probably know this person, Christo Grozin, who is a leader of Bellingcat, who did a lot to reveal the plans of Putin, especially and the military operation in Donbass. And recently he gave his interview, and he was asked, what is the reason that Putin decided to make this kind of large-scale war, military aggression against Ukraine? And they say, actually, was it his ambition to restore empire, or he really felt threatened by West, or this is thus the way to preserve his power? And Grozin said that, judging by his leaks, and his leak was from Moscow, from Kremlin, by the end of December, what is at stake is the Putin idea or Putin wish to preserve his power. It's very much pragmatic, so to say, solution. Again, along this kind of three phases which I described. And he would use the historical argument, without a doubt, historical matter, but a smokescreen to masquerade what is really at the stake. May I have a next slide? So to conclude, I'm coming to my final part, because basically I believe, and this is what I'm trying to say, I illustrate at the very beginning of my presentation, there is a crucial difference between Russian and Ukrainian politics. And given the age, given the rotation of elites, ethnic composition of the Kiev elites and the Russian elites, they look like a two worlds apart. So when it started, when this difference started, not in 1991. In 1991, the two countries look very much similar, basically. Ukraine looked a smaller copy of Russia, or Russia looked like a larger copy of Ukraine. The real bifurcation started in 1993-1994, and both Ukraine and Russia faced a deep political crisis of different character, but in both cases, the president was put on the risk, their power, Yeltsin in Russia and Kravchuk in Kyiv. In Kyiv, it was due to the economic crisis and political crisis, which led to the early elections in 1994, and the elections clearly revealed the deep political divides in Ukraine, East versus West. And this divide was not just regional, but also they also coincided with the ethnic and language preferences. So it was very much Yugoslav-like scenario. At that time, CIA came with a prognosis that Ukraine is heading to a civil war between Russian-speaking East and Ukrainian-speaking West, in comparison with which, and here I'm quoting verbatim, Yugoslav war will look like innocent picnic. Russia has a similar deep crisis, but the crisis was a different character. It was a conflict between Yeltsin as a president and his parliament. The parliament denied his legitimacy, and the crisis ended with the decision of Putin to send tanks against the Russian parliament and to bombard them. And this is how the Russian crisis ended. While the Ukrainian crisis had a very different solution, peaceful solution, because basically in the result of the free elections, Kravchuk has lost and gave his power peacefully to his next president follower, Kuchma. And this is what happened there. And we showed really that this is very much different political trajectories. And the result, we have a two political mechanism. In Russia, with the oppression of the opposition, you don't really have a kind of rotation of elites. There are some kind of democratic procedures, but they are very much fake, because basically the story is that one president appoints the other. And since the last 30 years, only three Russian presidents, Yeltsin, Medvedev, and Putin. And Ukrainian story was much different, because in Ukraine, practically with every new elections, you have a new president, with only exception Kuchma, who's won two elections. And basically the story is that if democracy is judged by the fact that you could never really guess who will be next president, Ukraine in this sense looked like probably perfect democracy. Nobody could really guess who will be next president. And since the 30 years, Ukraine has a 6 presidents, twice that much as Russia. There is a very good article by Dmitry Furman, one of the leading Russian historians, unfortunately deceased, good friend of mine. In 1995, he wrote a very good article, Ukraine and us meaning Russians. He actually made the conclusion, this is really point of departure between Russia and Ukraine, because they demonstrated two very much radically different solutions to political crisis. And basically what he said in his article, that Ukraine passed an exam in democracy, whereas we Russians failed in October 93. And what he also emphasized, that this is sound very surprising and probably even paradoxical, because Ukraine did it, this change, in much worse economical situation. Basically, Ukraine chose democracy on the empty stomach, he put it. So basically, it led against the premises that to have a democracy, have a well-being, economical well-being, which is not the case of Ukraine. And this leads us to another kind of conclusion, that probably this we could not explain. This is radical bifurcation, but just the events on the, say, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. That probably the longer perspective, long durée perspective should be given. I couldn't dwell on it too much because time is running out, but let me just focus on one probably factor. May I have a next slide? And the factor is, okay, this is some kind of the story which I have to tell. This will be the diversion. I'm sorry, I forgot about this. So basically, this is Ernst Gellner. You probably know him. He's a famous theoretician of modernization, also nationalism. And he once made such a very good joke. He was very famous for his sense of humor. And he made a joke about the existence of some genre of the big thing books. Books that has a very much kind of the expressive, impressive name title, but there is nothing to write about it in the book itself. Like I probably know that Italian and Czech army was not that much famous for its military capabilities. So you could easily imagine the book, which would be called the full list of the Italian or Czech military victories, or a book like Struggle of Arabic Muslim countries for the gender equality, or a list of the all successful Ukrainian revolutions, or by the talking long road of Russia to democracy. So basically, the story is that the Russian road to democracy is very much short. We have several cases, examples, success, not that much success story, but still tries to reform Ukraine, Russia throughout the last 200 years. Reforms Alexander I, Alexander II, then 10 months or 9 months during the 1917 revolution, then Khrushchev reforms, then Gorbachev reforms and the Yeltsin reforms. But the real tragedy is that each period of these reforms ends in the much longer period of reaction and repression regimes. That's what historians call Russian pendulum. So in this sense, if you compare Ukrainian book on the road to democracy is somewhat longer than the Russian one, and may have next slide. And the reason is that it has to do something with Ukraine being the same part of the space as Russia, has been much more exposed to the West. And one of the main factors was exactly this so-called Polish factor. Polish factor, which is embodied in the Polish Rzeczpospolita and also in the Polish elites, which made a majority in Ukrainian territory among the nobility until the First World War. And if you trace the regions of Ukraine and the regions of Polish impact on Ukraine, intensity of Polish factor, you see this kind of four regions. These regions very much coincide with the nowadays political linguistic divisions in Ukraine. So you see this how the history works, so to say. And one of the crucial factor of this impact, again, I wouldn't go that long. I have in my book and also by other historians who did it. Basically, the story is that why Polish factor is that important. It's not the Polish factor per se. It's a rather Western factor. Western factor as a specific character of political organization, which means limits of monarch power. That monarch power has been very much limited by several rule obligations, so to say, vassal-suzerain relations, but in the case of Poland specifically by the large nobility, which exercise a lot of power in comparison to monarch. And if you talk about Ukrainian Kazakh history, which is leading symbols of Ukrainian identity, basically, even so Kazakhs fought with Poland nobility, they very much emulated this Polish nobility in their will to have the same size of the rights and privileges as a Polish nobility was. And now see what you have there as a result, you have a long tract of the self-governing institutions, which could be roughly called as a civil society in the Middle Ages, early modern time, like independent self-governing cities, like the universe, all the kind of things, which very much resembles the seeds of the future civil society. Again, it's very much probably sounds like a speculation. You could focus on that in the questions and answer section. But story is, and may have it the next slide, that what I'm driving at is the main thesis of the Ukrainian liberal historiography, which in this century has been represented by Ivan Lysakhrudnitsky, one of my favorite authors. Basically, he very much claims that the main difference between Ukraine and Russia is not in language, not in religion, not in culture. They differ here, but they're not that much difference. They're in large extent they're similar. The main difference is in the political organization, political traditions, in relations between the state and society, in the kind of the long track of the self-government institution, and most importantly, memory of this institution, as it has been codified in the 19th century in literature, more specifically by Shevchenko and his followers, this famous Cossack myth of Ukraine, which is very much about so-called Ukrainian liberty and specific political traditions. And he heavily relies on the works on the probably two most systematic thinkers of Ukrainian history, which will be Lipinski and Drahomano. And you have this kind of quotations. So basically, this is the story. And this, I would say, make the essence of Ukrainian history. And this is something that Putin doesn't really understand. He doesn't want to understand, so to say, that he still believes in very much 19th century convention that Ukrainian identity is very much based on language. And therefore, all the non-Ukrainian speakers, not Ukrainians, and therefore, by definition, Russian-speaking population in Ukraine are Russians, because he very much relies on the language as a main criteria of identity, which doesn't work in nowadays Ukraine. So to conclude, if I may, to wrap up my discussion or my presentation, may I have the last slide. So to answer the question, whether history matters, yes, it matters. It matters a lot, because it basically explains why Putin fails in Ukraine. And the reason being that Putin doesn't understand Ukraine. he miscalculates Ukraine. Probably his miscalculation about Ukraine was the biggest mistake, which probably brings his collapse sooner as he was probably expected. But then we have to say what kind of history matters, because history may have different meanings. For sure, I would say it's not the history that Putin himself presents. It's a kind of the mispresentations, false history, manipulations. This is not history that should be taken seriously in any way. It should be confronted with, but as I said, it doesn't really make sense if you want to understand what is going on nowadays in Ukraine, particularly what's now going in the field of the war. I would say that more than that, with this kind of history, probably historical memory does, in a sense that it will have to reveal the real plans of Putin. But again, it does really help us to understand what is at the stake. So my point and my conclusion that what really matters, what kind of history matters we have to use when we want to say to get a better understanding of the things going on in nowadays Ukraine and during the Russian-Ukrainian wars, we have to tune to another history. The history has been protected by Brodel and nowadays recently by Armitage in his historical manifesto, for the history that may serve as a guide to action in the present, relying on the resources of the past. So on that point, I would like to finish my presentation. I will be happy to answer your questions and respond to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Yaroslav. I will mediate the question and answer session. So we already posted the request. So maybe while we are waiting for the audience to pose their questions, okay, I want to ask you this question. So I feel like Putin is not ignorant of the century-long engagement of Ukraine into democratic institutions of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but his propaganda basically aims at the feelings of resentment of post-Soviet Russians, right, who wants to regain their power over this discourse of dominance. So in your previous works, you actually argued that Russia's colonization was a hybrid phenomenon, meaning that it's not only proceeded with acquiring territory and exploiting the resources of Ukraine, but also had this concept of modernization of agrarian society. Have you changed your opinion after the war started about the imperial part of Ukraine's history and how we can actually explain the recent imperial appetite of Russia?
Not at the least. Thank you so much, Julia, for this question. Not at the least, I haven't changed. I still believe this imperial ambitions and the post-colonial status is very much important, but I'm not dwelling on that because too many people are doing that. Okay. This has become nowadays, so to say, the bon mot that everybody tries to do post-colonial studies, so say. First of all, Ukrainian case is very much complicated because Ukraine has been if Ukraine is a colony, has been a very much peculiar colony. If I say so, it combines, Ukraine started as Scots and ended as Irish. And there also Ukraine has been overrepresented both in the power and the position, so to say. So therefore it's very hard to this hybrid. What I'm saying here that you see, I not see empire as a kind of the evil old roots of all the evil. Because basically until the last century, empire was a norm. And have a different kinds of empire. Some of the empire actually was easily to modernize, and probably the British case will be probably the most important here, and Neil Ferguson, I believe, has rights to say. And I would just say that this is on the end of the Russian Empire. There was such a joke among Ukrainians that why should not British Empire annex us? Because then we'll be ready for independence in 20 years. See what I mean here? Because basically, even so, empire was evil, without a doubt, and Kozakh was evil, but still British Empire provides some kind of political patterns, so to say. If you look in India or Singapore or Taiwan, you could still feel it, so to say. Unlike in Russian case, because in Russian case, you have no kind of limitations of the monarchy, and therefore, even after the collapse of the Russian Empire or collapse of the Soviet Union, you have the kind of restoring of this old ways. So what I'm saying, I was trying to look and turn to another dimension, which is very much ignored. And in a sense, since I'm old, I'm getting to older style. There's something the history which has been, so to say, practiced before the post-colonial turn.
Okay, so I will proceed with the order questions were submitted in the chat. So question from Natalia Kovalchuk to you, not as a historian, but as a military analyst. What is your prediction for Russia-Ukraine war?
I'm not here as a military expert, no way, but there's some parallel which has been used by military experts, and let me just repeat them. So basically, what is strange about this war? That even so, this war of 21st century, which has a very sophisticated technology, this war is very much conventional one, which is basically a war on the front line with one manpower, and more importantly, an artillery war. The artillery plays the more important. So it makes sense. It's very much like the First or Second World War.
Okay.
Luckily enough, not the Third War. But that said, if you to compare this war, I believe the First War will be much more important, useful for prediction, because this is war of attrition, very much like the First War. After the short period of blitzkrieg, we have positional war of attrition. And in this war, this side has better chance to win, which has access to better resources, to bigger resources. If Ukraine would be left on its own, Ukraine would be no chance to win this war against Russia, because Russia, without doubt, has resources many times more than Ukraine is. But since Ukraine is very much supported by the West, then Russia has no chance, so to say. So judging by the experts, again, I'm saying here, I'm looking for the economist expert, military expert. They say that this is the victory of the war depends who would collapse first. And they predict that the chances, chances for collapse is better than, it's more predictable for Russia than for Ukraine. And we may expect this collapse from 3 to 9 months. So let's wait and see.
Thank you. The next question from Dmitro Romanovich. How do you think, would it be right to say that Putin discounted dignity factor of Ukraine and that was his main mistake in current war?
Without a doubt. Thank you for this question, because this is kind of the limitations of every dictator. Since dictator doesn't believe that there is some independent public opinion or independent civil society, he believes that every time any public opinion or civil society has emerged, it's manipulated. And in his case, it's manipulated by the West. He doesn't really understand the rhetoric, the logic of this new movements of middle-class rebellions, like Arab Spring, like Occupy Wall Street, like revolutions in Taiwan, Lebanon, Armenia, Kazakhstan, name it, so to say. Because basically, and this is, again, this is another point, the most interesting point of this new wave of revolutions, new wave, that they demand something that could be really articulated. And this is dignity. I wrote in my book that if you look on the history, on the recent mass protests in Chile, in Santiago, they look astonishingly similar to what's going in Maidan. Even sequence of the events, and most importantly, the main square in Santiago was called Square of Dignity. So this is something which I'm saying here. That basically, it's a very much that Putin doesn't really understand. Probably he doesn't want to understand the character of this movement. They're very natural. They very much say spontaneous, so to say, and they are not orchestrated. And this is what Putin fails to admit.
The next question from Professor Nancy Coleman. You wisely showed how historical memory involves manipulation of history, forgetting, and misrepresentation, but every nation has a national myth based on history, and they are very powerful. Are all national myths pernicious? What about the Cossack myth and other unifying myths for Ukraine?
No, not every myth is pernicious. My favorite author is Leszek Kolakowski. He wrote excellent book, short one, but excellent book of persistent myth, which basically says that even so our society could be named modern or postmodern, whatever it is, the myth is essentially important for cohesion of society, the kind of stories we're telling, so to say. So myth is some kind which is unescapable. But that said, there are myths which are toxic, and there are myths which are not toxic, so to say. For sure, if you treat a Cossack myth as a kind of xenophobic sense, that Cossacks such as Khmelnytsky used to kill, mass assassinate Jesuits or Poles or Jews, and this is something that has been done nowadays, that is pernicious myth. But nobody knows in Ukraine thinking about Khmelnytsky this way, but they're talking by Bandera. It's a kind of irony is that the two slogans that are prescribed to Bandera nowadays, which is called the one is actually belongs to Benjamin Franklin and also to Victor Hugo. Nobody knows this is not Bandera, but so Bandera sounds very much, should say, liberal, but again saying that is in some cases myths could be very much pernicious and toxic, and then historians are obliged to fight them. But in some cases, if they not really meant too toxic and they put some confusion, I say that yes, we can understand they're a myth, but I don't see kind of the need to fight them, so to say.
So what are the other myths except for Cossack myths that unify Ukraine as a nation?
A Holodomor, famine, without a doubt. Famine. And this is given by the surveys. I would say that Yushchenko was total failure in every possible respect, but one. His politics on the famine. It succeeded. And right after the the Ukrainian parliament accepted the law, the famine, survey shows immediately that every region, regardless this is east or west, south or north, Russian speaking or Ukrainian speaking, there is a large consensus on three things. When the famine was real, second, it was orchestrated by Kremlin, artificial, and third, more important, there is a large consensus with a genocide. So what I'm saying here, this is probably one of the crucial difference between Ukraine and Russian historical memory. It's an attitude to Stalin. In Russia, there is a tendency to look at the Stalin as a kind of the architect of the victory, great victory, so to say. The one who raised Russia from knees to status of great superpower. In Ukraine, he is treated very much differently as an architect of repressions and most part of the famine. So what I'm saying again, if you want to look Ukraine divided, let's start talking about Bandera. But if you want to say Ukraine united, start talking about Stalin. Quite different, you have different effects.
Okay. The next question from Professor William Hagen. According to Putin's essay of 2021 on the historical relation of Russia to Ukraine, he claims the Bolsheviks created Ukraine as a state, but he acknowledges Ukraine as a nation, but part of the triune nation of East Slavic peoples independent of the West. That is the Russians, West Bank Ukrainians, and Belarusians. Ukraine, in Putin's view, may exist legitimately only in alliance with Russia, never against it. He mentioned the so-called German-Austrian relationship as a model.
So this is some kind, how should I say, very tricky. The language of Putin, the terms he uses. Because basically in Ukrainian and Russian uses, there is narod and natia. And quite often they use interminglingly as a kind of synonyms, which are not. So basically, Putin doesn't say that Ukraine is a nation. Putin says Ukraine is narod, ethnic group. And nation is something that belongs to Ruski Mir. This is where crucial differences. I follow that, so to say. So he doesn't see Ukraine as a separate nation. The nation is Russian plus Ukrainian plus Belarusian, made from three ethnic groups. So this is something which is very important for gain. It's also Ukrainians who does it, because they don't have the kind of difference between nation and narod, given the long tradition of the populism, narodniki, and narodovstvo, and also because in the Soviet Union, the term nation was some kind abhorred, something which I believe they related to the Western capitalist war, so to say. So what I'm saying again, if I get this question correct, Putin doesn't accept Ukraine as a nation, because nation means nation state. He clearly see that this is ethnic group, and this actually what made this miscalculation, because I said Zelensky is a Jew, Arahami is a Georgian, Kim is a Korean, and this is something which doesn't fit in the concept of narod. So this is something which Putin represents therefore as a kind of difference that Ukraine and Russia doesn't really understand this kind of difference. Just to finish this, I believe you're perfectly aware of this difference between ethnic nation and civic nation. So originally in 19th century, Ukraine emerged as an ethnic nation. And in this sense, for ethnic nation, language as criteria was extremely important, because basically Ukrainians tend to define themselves through language. And this is very much 19th century pattern. But the 20th century, Ukrainians got huge transformation already under the Soviet Union, but more particularly during the last 30 years, from ethnic to civic identity. And this always shows in all the surveys in Ukraine, that if you write people about their identity, more often they respond Народ України rather than Ukrainians, or громадяни України. They choose Ukrainian citizens than Ukrainians. Even so, Ukraine is very high, but Ukrainian citizens is much more higher, so to say. This is exactly what I'm claiming here, that Putin understands identity nations very much in 19th century fashion, as ethnic groups that are united along the language.
Yeah, but what about his use of this pan-Slavic notion of triune nation, триединый народ, that resonates with Little Russian complex of the late 19th century? Does he also manipulate with this kind of the feeling of fraternal friendship, targeting certain populations in Ukraine that still consider themselves part of this Eastern Slavic civilization?
This is exactly a point. What I'm believing is that point of attraction of Ruski Mir, that is very much hard to define. It's ambivalent. And the more ambivalent, the more it's the more it's, how should I say, acceptable or more attractive. Because basically we are not quite sure whether he means also Kazakhstan or not. Because basically, again, I'm saying basically too often, Ruski Mir is very much based on Orthodox identity, not just religion, not just ethnic, so to say. So this is basically very much, how to say, they have a different dimension here. So you don't clearly understand, it's really interesting to, there must be some study that compare the 19th century version of the Triedиный народ and nowadays the Ruski Mir and nowadays. But I would say that what is difference there? That in 19th century, the main divergent or the main example that destroyed the concept of the Slavic unity were Poles. Since they were Slavic, but they were not pro-Russian, they were pro-West. So what I'm claiming here, that imagination of the Kremlin, as particularly in the last 30 years, it was Ukrainians in 20th century, the first century, Ukrainians took place of the Poles. This is exactly Poles, Ukrainians that do not comply to the concept of this Slavic unity, and therefore it raises so much irritation and hatred from Putin.
Thank you. Another question from Tanya Marker. From Putin, quote, only a person without a heart could fail to miss, someone added and I lost that. Only a person without a heart could fail to miss the Soviet Union. Only someone with no head would want to restore it. True, his end game is to reduce democracy at a global level.
Yeah, but actually, again, this quotation, which by the way is not his, it's very much widespread. There are several Ukrainian leaders also saying the same, tell the same story, like Moroz, leader of Socialist Party. So this is actually some very much, how to say, the general quotation, but that I forgot what I was to say. I'm sorry. I was getting to dancing too long. But exactly what I'm saying. This quotation belongs to the first phase of Putin. That Putin tried to behave very liberal, very democratic, very suave, and even very much pro-Western. Even so, he was claiming that collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster. He didn't finish that. This is not the end of the question, the end of the sentence. He ended that, but it would be insane to try to restore it at that time. So this is when the Putin was, the loving baby of the West, so to say, at that time. That everybody was believed that Putin would put Russia on the Western side. So I can say Putin himself went through transformation. Let me put this way: there's a very good study of the comparison of the discourses of the presidential speech of Putin and Medvedev. And basically what it says that until 2010, the basic concept both in Putin and Medvedev was modernization. They really thought Omanization of Russia, whatever they mean by that. But since Putin returned to power, the new term emerges and it replaces demonization, which is never mentioned again. And this is security. Security and the threat. So this is the third Putin, so to say, the third phase of the Putin.
Thank you. A question from our graduate students. I'd be interested to hear more about how economic ties or integration between Russia and Ukraine, particularly after late imperial industrialization in the Soviet era, and since fit into this picture, whereby, as I understand your presentation, a meaningfully different post-Soviet political culture appears as a determinant factor with deep roots.
It's not exact. Thank you so much for this question. That doesn't really sound like a Marxist, because it makes impression, these things I believe economy is very important, but it's not economy, it's modernization, it's many factors. Because I basically says political is very much more important than the economics, so to say. Because you couldn't have economics so without sustainable development without political reforms. And therefore it's related by cultural determinant, whatever. But what are you saying here? This is a very important question. Thank you for that. Because basically, what Putin fails to notice, and many of the observers fail to notice, there's deep transformation of the economy in Russia, Ukraine, even in Belarus, which means transformation from industrial economy to service economy. Basically, most oligarchs did their wealth on the industrial economy because it's very much state economy, controlled by the state. And therefore, it's a reach of the corruption, nepotism, all the kind of things. But there's a new trend emergence, and this will be probably 0 years, which emerges of a civil sector, civil economy. IT, university, restaurant, all the kind of tourism, all the kind of things. And I have the proof for that. This my friend economist did calculations that since the beginning of the 0 years, Ukraine shifted to the service economy. And that means the middle class emerges exactly in this sector, not industrial sector, but in service economy. And most of them are younger because they graduate from the unions to the works in IT, all the kind of so-called creative class. And therefore, by this token, you have this kind of process both in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. And therefore, we have this kind of the protests everywhere there. And they are very much focused on the largest city, be the capital or just large city, when you have the focuses of this service economy. There has been studies done recently in Ukraine, which clearly shows that with emergence of civil service economy, there is a new regional divide in Ukraine, in a sense that economic activity in the east fades away slowly but surely, and the center for economy shift to the center and to the west, which is basically service economy. If you visit my native city, Lviv, it has been industrial city in the 90s, and now the last 20 years actually is probably capital of the service economy. You could see very different. But again, I'm saying it's concentrated in large cities, and therefore you have this kind of divide. They have this protest in large cities, but not in the middle-sized city or the villages, because they have still live in this kind of industrial economy or agricultural sector. So this is what I'm saying here. It's very much, again, sorry for that, because basically it's this new type of modernization starting in the West in the 60s, with the shift to the high technology, with the end of industrial city. Nowadays, industry emigrates to the kind of the countries like China, like Cambodia, this kind of the country of the periphery, so to say. And this also explains what happens in Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus, and probably in other countries.
Thank you, Yaroslav. It doesn't look that we have more questions. So I would like to thank you for enlightening us with your new perspective on Russia-Ukraine relationship and the role they play in this war. And I wish you the safest. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We had the 3 air alarms today in Lviv. Just to tell you the story, what's going on. And I just met my friend, colleague, student, who returned from the front line, has been there as a journalist for 2 months. And he says there's crucial differences between being there and here. And Lviv looks like a heavens for him, so to say, quite normal life. So we are relatively safe. And I wish that, I believe the same story goes for Kyiv nowadays, and even Dnipro and Kharkiv, they say Kharkiv is restoring to normality. Unfortunately, it's not Kherson, not Donbass. But let's wait and see. We are very confident, so to say, and the mood is rather positive, so to say. So thank you so much for your support.
There were more questions which I actually missed because I was checking Q.
I'm ready to answer.
You're ready? Okay. Sorry, I apologize because I was looking in the chat and apparently there is a Q&A column that I completely missed. Sorry. So, okay. Catherine Jolag, based on your fascinating historical analysis, what do you think we can expect for Ukraine and Russia in the short run, say 20, 30 years from now?
Thank you so much. It's always emerges during the Q&A session. The question is not about the history, not about the past, about the future. It looks like historians are very good for predictions. I believe they're very, probably the worst kind to make predictions. But based on what I know, again, it's dependence on the kind of my experts. I try to develop my connections with the experts, especially those who rely. So what I'm saying here, much depends on on two things about Ukraine. Whether Ukraine would be ready to finish what we call homework with reforms. And the crucial reform is a judicial reform. This is something that has never been done, finished, and we expect to be very close to finish it before the war. And I will say this definite criterion for irreversibility of the processes of democratization, economic development. And let's wait and see. But there is a second factor that emerged recently, and this is a very important factor. It's a Marshall Plan. We demanded this Marshall Plan. We asked back to demand this Marshall Plan together our Western colleagues in 2014, right after the Maidan, that Ukraine deserves and badly needs kind of Marshall Plan to finish with reforms. And then we were ridiculed, very much so. And nowadays it's a more word of the day. That there has been not just discussed Marshall Plan, there's always details. I know who's be responsible for completing this kind of Marshall Plan. So basically what I'm saying, no nation could perform reforms on its own, on her own, without Western help, outside help. So if this would be the case, if Ukraine would complete homework with the help of the Marshall Plan, because Marshall Plan not just about economics, also political complement, I believe that in 20, 30 years, probably even earlier than that, so I could be able to see, Ukraine could emerge as a new, how should I put it, East European tiger, on a pair probably with Poland, the largest state more important state in the realm between Baltic and Black Sea, and Berlin and Moscow. But again, on condition that Ukraine would meet those two criteria, judicial reform and Marshall Plan. What about Russia? I'm not sure, because talking about the social pendulum, which means there is chances, there are dangers, there is threat that in 20, 30 years, we have an emergence of after Weimar Republic, may emergence of new authoritarian leader, which has been the story of the last 200 years in Ukrainian history, Russian history. So there must be specific measure applied to Russia as well as to Ukraine. And I would describe as a 3D: demilitarization, decentralization, and most importantly, de-Russification. By Russification, I'm not mean the destruction of Russian identity. I mean that Russia should be turned into normal country, refusing or leaving behind all these ambitions to restore Great Rus or Russian Empire. And this is something which I believe should be done in Ukraine. It's a Russian homework, without a doubt, but should be made with a kind of the not interference, but with assistance or help or dictation, even so we could claim it, of the West. Then there's a chance for Russia to become a normal country, and then you have probably in a 1 or 2 generations, the reconciliation between Ukraine and Russia would be very much possible.
So I will choose questions related to your specialization history instead of just giving prognosis. So the question from Natalia Hoshilek, continuing the topic of the imperialist identity, what can be done with this phenomenon of Russians, even so-called anti-war or good Russians seem to look at Ukraine as at a younger brother? So do you agree with this statement? And what?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I would say not all liberal Russians keeps to these views. I know many friends who are friends of mine, they don't feel that way, and they're very sorry for what Russia did, and they ask me for forgiveness if they had nothing to blame, because personally they are very anti-Putin, so to say. So I don't really believe this is something which is universal feeling. Without a doubt, there's many liberals who also say this way. So let's wait and see. But again, as I said, this is something that be done about this kind of Russification. I would tell you what should be done in Ukraine, and this is something which might be discussed. I believe that Russian culture in Ukraine should be cancelled. Not in a way that we have to destroy Russian books, Tolstoy or Chekhov or Pushkin, no way, or just destroy monuments. That's not saying. They have to be relegated to the normal place, and which means bookshelves, libraries, classes, all the kind of things. You see what this point here? Have you ever noticed this? There's only one literature and culture that claims to be great. This is great Russian culture. Have you ever noticed the great French culture, or great English culture, or great German culture? So exactly what I'm saying here, this is something which is very unnatural about this kind of greatness, so to say. So basically, always this kind of thing, I'm always wondering why there's not even one monument to Shakespeare, and there are so many monuments to Pushkin. What does it really mean in this kind of the case? So what I'm saying here, to become Russia normal, to bring it to the borders, this cancel of Russian literature for a while is a necessity. And again, I would here refer to Alexander Nevzorov. You probably know the name, who made recently a very important statement. He's himself very much Russian. He parts of Russian culture. Says that basically what culture means. Culture is opposition to barbarity. It's a sense of the culture to keep people from barbarity. If culture fails to do so, it has to be cancelled at least for a while. And this is something which I would sign myself.
Thank you, Yaroslav. We have just one last question from a graduate student. How much historical causality does Professor Rytsak think can be established between historical phenomena such as Polish-Lithuanian Western influence or cause of democracy and the different political attitudes that exist in Ukraine today?
Again, my favorite historian, Alexander Gershchenko. I believe that not that many much mentioned nowadays, because it's just post-colonial studies, all kind of things, but he was one of the wisest men. By the way, he was Russian, born in Odessa, and made a career in Harvard as a professor of history economy. And basically says that historians should be very modest in their predictions, causation, so to say. There's no such thing like causation. There is no such thing like a determination. What he says, the task of historian is just to try to track various tendencies and to see which tendencies are much relevant and less relevant, so to say, or even irrelevant, so to say. This is exactly what I'm trying to do. So basically, in my presentation, what I'm writing, I'm trying to reinstall hierarchy of the factors, so to say, because more often than not, we turn to historical memory, to the discourses, all the kind of thing. They're important without a doubt. They're important very much, and they're also entertaining. It's very entertaining place to work to do. But somehow focusing on this kind of the stories, we tend to forget, we tend to ignore the factors which I believe is of the same importance, not the more important, so to say. And I say for our space, it's still modernity, modernization, kind of things. I hardly can find any historian in our region, be it Polish, Ukrainian, Russian, who ignore this notion completely, even the younger one, because this is state we live in. It's not as much to say not such need in being United States or Belgium or Great Britain, because still we live in kind of different historical zones, historical times. So this is exactly what I'm saying. It's not about casualty. It's about tendencies. Without that, contingency meant very much, especially during the war, and personality memories the war. But even within the contingency, there's certain tendency. Therefore, I'm saying that this is the task of historians, try to track this tendency and to see which of these tendencies are more relevant and which are the less relevant. And therefore, try to establish very, very modestly, but you have preserved, try to make them come very, very cautious projection into the future. And this is what Alexander Gershon-Cohen believes is the task of every good historian.
Thank you, Yaroslav. So on this optimistic note, I want to thank our presenter and the audience for joining our discussion today and the talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава. Stay well.